Hi guys, how are you doing today? I am coming to you back from my office. I'm home from Thanksgiving break and it's Tuesday today, so I've been back for a couple of days and I wanted to touch base with you. I had posted earlier last week asking for a couple questions for a Q&A, and I've gotten a couple questions and wanted to kind of break them down by different categories, so each video will be a different question. And a big one that came up for me that people had asked about, and I'm not surprised, especially during the holidays, having to spend so much time with family, is a question about boundaries. And more specifically, how do we set parameters around ourselves to protect us when we have family members who are triggering, who don't understand us, who make us worse, who make us not feel very good. And it can be really, really hard when we've grown up in the same family, and family is a very, very specific and personal thing that we all have a lot of trouble with. But it's also really, really important because although family can be blood, they can also be some of the hardest people to be around. They can be super triggering. Holidays are not always enjoyable for everyone if we are coming from a dysfunctional family, if we have trauma, if we have anything like that. And so I kind of wanted to talk about, especially as we head into the holidays, talking about boundary setting and what do we do to kind of set boundaries around ourselves in an appropriate and helpful way so that we can not only protect ourselves but protect our loved ones as well. So I've kind of broken it up into 5 different ways that I think can be really helpful to set boundaries around family members or friends as well, especially if they are not providing as much benefit as they are harm to ourselves. So the first thing is knowing what your limits are. And by limits, I mean certain things we just have to kind of handle. Sometimes we have to put up with things. We all have our own quirks and tendencies. And so sometimes when we're with our family, we just say, oh, that's Aunt so-and-so, and that's just what Dad does. And sometimes that's okay, and we can totally move past it. But sometimes we can't, and it's something that's very, very triggering. And so first is just knowing what your limits are. What are things you can handle, and what are things you cannot handle? Sometimes we don't realize we can't handle something until we're pretty far down the way and we're like, God, why am I being so triggered? Why am I so stressed out or sad or anxious? And it's because patterns have repeated themselves and we are being cued by something that is causing us a lot of turmoil. And so knowing what your limits are, going into a situation, going into a holiday, knowing what your triggers are can be really helpful. Not that you need to go looking for them, nor do I think you should, because when we go looking for things, we also will find things that we're looking for, but more so just being aware of what are no-nos and what are things we can handle. Then once we've set that limit, knowing what is below the belt. So sometimes there are very certain things that are really harmful for us that our family members do. And so knowing what that below the belt is, knowing that if something happens and we go to this point, if things escalate and we get to this situation, then I'm out. So knowing how to set that boundary. Boundaries can be physically, knowing what your limit is and what below the belt is. So that might mean removing yourself from the house if a certain topic comes up or if a certain family member does something. It can also be just topics to avoid. So this is a no-no. This is not something we're going to be talking about. And if it happens, I'm leaving the room or I'm going to do something different. And then I think the next kind of step, once you've discovered personally what you can handle, is knowing how to properly communicate that. That doesn't mean that the receiving end is going to understand it or be okay with it or believe it. And sometimes it's not even a safe enough environment to communicate it. But I think you also want to know how to properly communicate what you're feeling so that those boundaries can be set in an appropriate way and so that the other person can kind of be aware of what the boundary is, especially when we're talking about family and we're going to have to be at family events and we are going to be having to spend time with each other. Allowing them the space to know what a no-no is so they can choose if they want to cross that limit or respect it. But sometimes if you set limits and you set that boundary and they don't know about it, then then it can end up being way more complicated and worse. And again, this needs to be specified that this is if we are in a safe environment where we feel that we can communicate without things escalating, where we have enough trust with that loved one that they can hopefully hold that space. If we don't, and we need to set a boundary internally without them knowing, and if they cross it, you can remove yourself. You have every right to do that as well. But if the communication is available and you can communicate with this person, it can be helpful to let them know, and for you to say out loud, this is my boundary, and if it gets crossed, this is below my belt, we're out of here. And then I think another thing to focus on is, what is the goal here? So are we going to a family event just to appease the other family members? Do we get joy out of it? Are there parts of us that really enjoy spending time with that person? And all of that is great until they cross over our boundary that we don't like, or we get triggered by something, in which case knowing what your goal is, knowing what you're trying to accomplish. What type of relationship are you trying to have with that person? Do you want no relationship at all? Or do you want some relationship, but there's just certain areas that we can't talk about, or we can't engage in? Or if we have alcoholism in the family or something, might be triggered by it. And so we can have fun and do things when there's no drinking, but when there is drinking involved, it can look very different. And so kind of understanding what your goal is and what you're trying to accomplish, and then make a plan for it. So putting yourself in that situation, if you're going over to a loved one's house that you might be triggered at, what plan do you have in place to help you feel safest, to feel more comfortable, but ultimately still get to enjoy family time? And then I think a part of this that sometimes gets overlooked and is an interesting component, and probably where therapy comes in if we're really having a lot of dysfunction in our family, is grieving what either once was or what we wish there was. So if we're talking about boundary setting with family members like parents or siblings, and maybe we had a really good relationship at one point with that family member and things have changed, and however it happened, there's this component of grieving the relationship that once was, or if there never was a relationship, but it might be with our mom or our dad, grieving the image of what a mom could be or should be, or what we wanted our dad to be, is a huge component, because a lot of the times we put ourselves in situations without setting boundaries, and we let families hurt us and walk all over us, either intentionally or unintentionally, because they are a part of us and we haven't grieved and worked through these concepts that are really big and really hard. And so we get to this point where we allow these things to happen, whether it's subconsciously or consciously, because they are a part of us, and we have a hard time setting boundaries because we don't want to hurt people that we love or once loved. And so there's a big part of this that involves grieving the stories that we once had, or the things we'll never get to have. And we can't always grieve on our own. Sometimes we need to talk to people. Sometimes we need therapy. We spend a lot of time in here talking about grieving, even it doesn't have to be a person who's passed away. It doesn't have to be because someone's sick. It can be grieving a lost job, or grieving a family member that isn't who they used to be, or grieving with an illness, or anything like that. It doesn't have to be what we usually think if someone's passed away, or it can be through divorce, or a holiday without a family member because families have separated, or kids have moved away to college. I mean, it can be anything. And so I think that there's this really extra component that I added in with the five ways that we can help set boundaries, and it has to do with grieving and working through the sadness that comes with setting boundaries around people we love that we wish we didn't have to, but for our own sake and our own health and our own well-being, we have to. And so making sure that we put ourselves first, we know what our limits are, we know how to take care of ourselves, but we still want to be around these people, then I recommend, making sure that you know what your limits are, you know what is below the belt, you have a goal and a plan for when you go into the situation. You learn how to properly communicate with that person. Chances are, if we're setting boundaries around someone, we have conflict and there's probably dysfunction. And so we might not be able to communicate appropriately or very well. And so that can also be helpful if you see a therapist on knowing how to communicate with family. But even just looking up proper or helpful communication tools can be really helpful as well. I actually have some that I can post about later on. Please comment down below if you're interested in learning about proper communication tips and tools. And then grieving. Grieving is the last one. So those are the 5 ways that I recommend setting boundaries around family members or friends as we head into the holidays or just in general. I know this topic is not always fun, it's not always helpful, but I am a huge proponent of boundary setting. I do it in here with my clients all the time about a lot of different things. Boundary setting means that we're respecting ourselves, which is tied into self-love, which is a whole different topic I will be talking about later. And it has to do with loving ourselves and knowing our worth and not putting ourselves in situations where we'll feel crappier, even by people we love. So that's it for today. Let me know if you have any questions. Comment down below if this is a topic that you're interested in, if you'd like me to expand more on it. And I look forward to talking to you guys soon. Thank you.